Finally, the issues persist. Well, aloha there, and yeah, it does mess up the camera whenever it does stream, and if there's issues that persist with that. But anywho, I'm here, and I could go over where I left off with the Victorian era. I didn't finish all of this. And I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because there's a lot of it. So I'll get to the gist of everything. Let me actually look at the contents so you can see how much there is. But what is it? Yeah, see also citations. No, events. Is that related to resources or just history? Oh yeah, understands. And contents. There's number one, terminology, imperialization, two, political, three, society, demographics, economy, mathematics, science, technology, engineering, moral standards, events, and all that. But anyhow, let's go with back to the very beginning or just where I left off. Probably around between. Alrighty, so we've gone through everything when it comes to religion, social standing, the time period, and when it comes to advancements, it's the industrial area, rise of medicine, modernization to our modern world compared to the Regency era, which that's how I'm reading all this. I want to understand Regency, but first let's understand what is the Victorian era, and then we go further and further. And I can compare this to it because the Victorian era is the most famous and easy to understand eras. Besides, in Great Britain, World War II, in the 1960s. So yeah, let's go with that. Domestically, the political agenda was increasingly liberal with a number of shifts in the direction of gradual political reform, social reform, and the widening of the franchise. So let's look at what the franchise is specifically here. Suffrage, political franchise, or simply franchise is the right to vote in public political elections in some languages and occasionally English. Let's go. Okay. In some languages and occasionally English, the right to vote is called active suffrage, as distinct from passive suffrage, which is the right to stand for an election. The combination active and yada yada yada. This also involves in the U.S. the women's suffrage movement. But in this case, in Great Britain, it is having rights of different political classes and ethnic groups. Now, let's go with there were unprecedented demographic changes. The population of England and Wales almost doubled from 16.8 million in 1851 to 30.5 million in 1901. So in a span of 5 decades, 50 years, half a century. Yeah, it almost doubled. And Scotland's population also rose rapidly from 2.8 million in 1851 to 4.4 million in 1901. However, Ireland's population decreased sharply from 18.2 million in 1841 to less than 4.5 million in 1901, mostly due to immigration and the Great Famine. Between 1837 and 1901, about 15 million immigrated from Great Britain, mostly to the United States, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. Thanks to educational reforms, the British population not only approached universal literacy towards the end of the era, but also became increasingly well educated. The market for reading materials for all kinds bloomed. Where should we go? Yeah, we should go here. Britain's relations with the other great powers were driven by antagonism with Russia, including the Crimean War and the Great Game. A Pax Britannica of international free trade was maintained by the country's naval and industrial supremacy. Now let's go with the Great Game. The Great Game was a political and diplomatic formation that existed in the most of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century between the British Empire and the Russian Empire of Afghanistan and neighboring territories in Central and South Asia. So, I did not know that. I knew that there was political agendas when it comes to geopolitics, but the Great Game between Great Britain and Russia, yeah, the fact that there were rivals around that era is a thing. Which is also makes me curious if they also had another thing with Germany. But but let's go with the Pax Britannica. Pax Britannica was the period of relative peace between great powers during which the British Empire became the global hegemonic power and adopted the role of global policeman. So, it's famous in the 19th century there was Pax Britannica, and then the 20th century it was Pax Americana. So yeah, that was my understanding of it. But yeah, that was the thing about the great British Empire. The sun never sets in the British Empire. Metaphor. Alright. Britons embarked on global imperial expansion, particularly in Asia and Africa, which made the British Empire the largest empire in history. National self-confidence peaked. Britain granted political autonomy to more advanced colonies in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Apart from the Crimean War, Britain was not involved in any armed conflict with another major power. And and also so much of the concert of Europe of peace, relatively peace, but that does show how their priorities are and how there is things like that. I mean, it's not the Crimean at all. It was also Franco-Prussian War, Wars, along with colonial proxy wars. I mean, if I just count that, yeah, you count it as not warlike. If you don't count wars overseas and colonies in Africa, Asia, especially when it comes to open wars. But let's take it that they just like to phrase things if it's in their own back door. That's pretty much the Western perspective in that time period. Apart from the Crimean War, Britain was not involved in any armed conflict with another major power. Yet, there's also proxy wars, but yeah, it is just a thing. The two main political parties during the era remained the Whigs, Liberals, and the Conservatives. By its end, the Labour Party has formed as a distinctive political entity. These parties were led by such prominent statesmen as Lord Melbourne, Sir Robert Peel, Lord Derby, Lord Palmerston, Benjamin Disraeli, William Gladstone, and Lord Salisbury. The unsolved problems relating to Irish Home Rule played a great part in politics in the late Victorian era, particularly in the view of Gladstone's determination to achieve political settlement in Ireland. And that's pretty much it. It talks about the cultural customs, society, the politics, advancement in technology, medicine, and a lot of things that was going around that time period. That was the Victorian era. But mainly it's famous because of Queen Victoria of England that reigned pretty much most of the 1800s. I mean, she literally died around 1901. And yeah, that's her reign remembered. Alright, let's go with terminology and periodization. In the strictest sense, the Victorian era covers the duration of Victoria's reign as Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from her succession on 20th June 1837 after the death of her uncle William 4th until her death on 22 January 1901, after which she was succeeded by her eldest son Edward the Cherish. Her reign lasted for 63 years and 7 months, a longer period from any of her predecessors. The term Victorian was in contemporaneous usage to describe this era. The era has also been understood in the more extensive sense as a period that possessed sensibilities and characteristics distinct from the periods adjacent to it, in which case it is sometimes dated to begin before Victorian's accession, typically from the passage or agitation, for during the 1930s, the Reform Act 1832, which introduced a wide-changing change to the electoral system of the England and Wales. I say what I made a mistake. Wide-ranging change to the electoral system in England and Wales. Definitions that purport a distinct sensibility or politics to the era have also kept skepticism, but I'm gonna say this. Skepticism. Yeah, it's just hard to speak in certain accents. Skepticism about the worth of the label Victorian, though there has been also been defenses of it. Michael Sandler was insistent that in truth the Victorian period is 3 periods and not 1. I believe that. In distinction, early Victorianism, the social political and unsettled period from 1837 to 1850, and late Victorianism from 1800s onwards, which is new waves of Athenicism and imperialism for the Victorian heyday, made Victorianism 1851 to 1879. He saw the later period as characterized by the distinct mixture of prosperity, domestic prosperity, and complexity. What G.M. Trovan simply called the mid-Victorian decades of quiet politics and warring prosperity. Decades of quiet politics and warring prosperity. Warring prosperity. Man, gotta practice more on that. And yeah, I mean, I could believe that because the way I look at it is that the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution happened around the mid 1800s, it's a way different life. And I'd say that because looking through the Gilded Age in the US. But, you know, I could talk about this another time. I pretty much have my time's up. And I'll definitely come back here. So, aloha.